Hey there, it's Nat. What I wanted to walk you through today is one of the 4 stage process models that I've been evolving over the last decade or so. Um, this is part based on my own experience. This is part based on many more mentors than one that I've worked with over the years that we've sort of added other parts to this. I don't feel like I can attribute it to one person or it would be fair to do so. But there's several who've contributed to this, and it also comes a little bit out of what I've seen in my journey in working with women around stepping up in startup and also finding their voices in their work and finding their passion and purpose. This sort of also comes out of a lot of the work that I've done in that respect. Tell me, gentlemen, I would love to hear if it kind of makes sense and rings true for you as well. But yeah, so I'm just going to talk you through the stages of it. I say this with a lot of love and just a little footnote that, if any part of this you find really, if it triggers something for you, if you need to put it down for a bit, that's fine. I would encourage you also to try and, stick through any parts of it that, if there's something in that, please, I would encourage you to stick through that. And if you've got some comments to add to the end, or there's some experience that you would like to add a comment on the end, please feel free to add that on as well. Without further ado, though, I'm going to walk you through this thing. And yeah, I'll talk you through as we go. So basically, essentially, there are basically 4 fundamental phases within this. At first, I notice a lot of us who grew out of decades past start doing this one. The second phase sits under the heading of trepidation, or the reaction within it. The next one, and there's another model I just did on the choice point as it relates to the warrior energy, that's kind of like, this is like a part within this. Aggression, rather. And then finally, at the end, expression. So, there's kind of like a particular energy or a challenge that goes with each one, right? So, for the first one with repression, part of what is going on in this phase is a little bit of that. This can be born out of a little bit of people pleasing, right? This is the phase where we choose not to say how it is. We choose not to speak up, possibly because there's been a circumstance earlier in life where we may have lived with somebody that was quite difficult to please, or there was something going on there that no matter what we did, we could never get it right. So that often results in the adopting of a coping mechanism of trying to appease and please in that respect, right? So this can have kind of each of these can sort of have like a negative side and a positive side to it. So on the negative side, it's exactly that. You're trying to appease and prevent conflict or prevent a negative outcome of some description, right? In the positive, because people pleasing is not all negative, there's an aspect of that that's also service-based, and it's about giving and wanting to love someone, right? And that's perfectly beautiful and noble and desirable. So we want this to have a positive side. It's just that the downside to this, some of the reason why we don't speak and we choose not to speak sometimes, is because we don't want to rock the boat. Yeah? But if we never ever speak up to what we want in relationships, personal, professional, or otherwise ever, it makes it very hard for it to be a two-way scenario and for us to get met, as well as to meet the other person, right? So that's the challenge of this. Okay, and if there were an action to help transcend this, it would be to start saying it, what we're not saying, yeah? Okay, so moving on to the next one. So on this side, this one's all about, if we're trying to say it, then this is about then our needs, our truth becoming visible, right? So this is about then being seen in how we feel. Now, again, a couple of things can happen here. One of the things that starts to happen when we start speaking up is we're feeling for a consequence and we're feeling for a reaction and how the other person's reacting to it, yeah? So this little thing can happen where we start to potentially, let me draw just a stick person for a second, right? And so there's this thing. Let's make her a girl. Let's give her a ponytail. Boop, boop, boop. And she's a little bit tribal. Just going to give her a little bit of clothes. All right, there we go. So she's starting to say something. And this might take a couple of forms, right? So it's like she might be talking to you about something. She might be wanting to know what you like and if you have an activity in common. So it might be like she says, hey, I like wearing my little cute skirts here. Right? But then the other person has an opinion and kind of like, oh, I hate skirts. I hate that kind of skirt. I don't really like them at all. So then she said this little piece of truth, but she's like, oh, well, I don't like skirts all the time. You know, it's kind of only a sometimes thing. So it's like what we can do sometimes when we realize that with the other person feels differently to how we do is like as fast as we started to put this truth out there, it's like we suck it back in. Yeah? And try and potentially change and adapt to be more relatable to the other person. So, I didn't really, yeah, maybe, I only like it sometimes. That's an example of sort of changing within that. So backtracking in that respect, or potentially changing the subject if it's like, that might be something that we might clash on, so I better change the subject. Or, like I said, sucking it back in. It's like you didn't quite, when we do that, it's like we're testing the waters with this, right? Of like we're starting to speak up, but if we get challenged, then we'll suck it back in because we're not fully owning it all the way yet. So if it's not really a grounded full body kind of reaction, it's sort of just coming out of our throat because we're just sort of testing it a little bit. Yeah? And yeah, definitely dependent upon the other person's reaction, and our fear of their reaction drives a lot of that. We're worried that it's going to break connection. What if it ends a relationship? What if it triggers the other person? Our fear is, if we go into fear, our fear is around creating disconnection. Because once we put a truth out there, the other person might polarize against it. They might react to it. So on the negative side, and again, I'm a little bit reluctant about using negative and positive, but let's just say on that side of the equation, that might be a fear-based response, right? On the positive side of this, there's actually always the potential for, have you ever had a moment where it's like you knew something and you really wanted to just, maybe it was an idea for business and you were so keen to just put it out there because you thought you were ready? Or alternatively, women might identify with this example of, you ever had a time where also you were feeling overwhelmed by something, say you were premenstrual, hormonal, already pushed to the limit in terms of coping and in that phase where just our brains are just haywire and potentially, it feels a bit overwhelming. We're moving into a phase when you look at a lot of the women who talk about journeying with your cycle, they talk about that being a phase of we're moving into potentially letting things go that aren't working in life. And certainly in the premenstrual phase, like it can be a bit like, whatever's overwhelming and whatever's too much in that moment, there's a tendency for us to want to write or say something that's like, I need to get rid of this as fast as I can because it's just too much. I've got too much and it's overwhelming me. This can be the time where we write emails that we regret. This can be the time that we say things that a week later, once we're calm again, we're like, oh crap, that turned into an ending when actually I wanted it to be a discussion around needs, right? So the healthy part of trepidation is that we often actually, if we're connected to our intuition, and let me just write this in here, consider intuition, we often actually get a red flag reaction within us, a hesitation that comes up when we know something that we're about to say or put out there is not, there's maybe a little bit more journeying with a truth to come up with yet, or maybe it's not representative of the whole of how we feel. Intuitively, there can be a very legitimate thing within here where we can feel a very real desire to consider it further. Yeah? And there might be something in that. So on the positive side of that, I say there's also an intuitive cue within that sometimes that we get when it might be a good idea to go a little bit deeper. The overall challenge of this phase, though, and the action to move through it, whatever your truth is to own it. Yeah? Not back away from it. Whether you choose to say it or not say it, it is the owning it. To get to this next one. Yeah? Okay, so in the next one, see, part of the challenge of this phase can be, and it's part of coming out of this as well, because the tricky thing is if you've been in this your whole life, sometimes when I talk to women about when they're having conflict in relationships or they're not getting what they want out of either business or romantic partnerships or dating, sometimes when I ask them, so tell me about your vision of what it is that you want and tell me about what you need out of this relationship, sometimes they're really good at telling me what they don't want, but they can't voice or identify what they do. Yeah? Because part of what we do when we go into this space is we go, well, what do you need? What's it going to take to be of service to how do I meet your needs? How do I keep you happy? Yeah? Which if we spend a lot of time doing that, we can become a little bit disconnected, potentially, not always, but sometimes, a little bit disconnected from what our own needs are. Yeah? So part of the challenge of when we're doing that is as we keep moving through this and as we're sort of not necessarily always fully owning what we want to say in here, the outside external response that we get back from the external world is that people don't know how to meet you. They don't know, if they don't know what your needs are, if you haven't clearly expressed to them what your vision is, what your needs are, how you want to be loved, how you want to be respected, how you want to work together, how do they know to give that to you? There's only so far that, people can be psychic before it helps if we communicate with them, right? And we have discussions around those things. So part of the challenge of this phase is that by the time that we start speaking, sometimes women can feel a bit like they say it, but people aren't listening. They feel like they're saying it, but they're not being respected and they're not being heard. And they're wanting acknowledgement still, right? Yeah? And they might feel a bit like there can be a backlog of resentment that builds up with this. And part of the resentment that builds up with this sounds a bit like you don't care about what I need. Yeah? It may not necessarily be the ultimate truth, but as we build, if we fall into that story and start building that story, then we'll start looking for evidence that that person's not noticing what we need, that they're not reacting when we wish they would. And then that can lead to, in this phase, what we fear that we're not having is impact, right? We fear that they're not noticing, we're not getting our message across. And part of the thing that we can do before we realize fully what's going on here is we end up blaming potentially the other person and thinking that we need to be louder and we need to be more forceful in one pathway to get our message across, right? So in the negative over here, particularly because as per operant conditioning and behavioural learning in Western society, many of us were raised with the idea and a parenting style in which negative and positive reinforcement was used when we were little to help us understand the difference between what behaviour is desirable and what has negative consequences, right? So is it any wonder as grown-ups we then can, as a coping mechanism and as a method of trying to influence others, we try to do the same thing, to point out to them when we're not feeling met or we feel that they're doing the wrong thing. Then we can go into trying to do what our parents did of, I need you to know that you hurt me and you're doing the wrong thing. So get the negative reinforcement across, right? On the shadow side of this one, it's coming back to, if you've seen my other model that I did on the warrior, this is where this one can play out of us slipping into the negative side of this when we feel like we're hurt or we feel like we're not being met. I've seen this occasionally with men as well as women, and especially when we feel out of control. Part of the reaction within this can be to want to get an impact. We either literally get loud this has turned into intimate, the irony. Intimidate. Isn't that funny that the remedy to that is intimate? Anyway, moving on. Sorry, that's a bit messy, but intimidate, is that meant to be that word? Or the other shadow side of that is retaliate. When potentially people feel out of control or somebody said something that maybe, hurt them, this can come into play. And then we go for, this is like over impact. It's like the bit of the phase of this is like not trusting how powerful our voice really is. And it's also we're not necessarily trusting that the other person cares and wants to do the right thing by us, and not necessarily trusting in that there can be a positive conversation around this, right? So ultimately, when we're building a relationship with anyone, or we're having a conversation about any work thing, we've got to come back to at some point. So what's the vision? What's our intention? And what do we both need? And what are our expectations? How do we work together? And how do we care for each other in this scenario? Yeah? So before we get to that, sometimes we can get a bit lost in, particularly if our expectation of by default is I expect not to be met, we can get stuck in this side. Yeah? I'm saying putting this on the positive side because there are circumstances in life where occasionally we need to be able to, when we're on the receiving end of aggressive energy, we need to be able to respond to that in an appropriate way, right? Part of the premise of self-defense training, and if I was to say this to anyone who's done martial arts training, it'll probably make sense to you when I say this, of match. It may not necessarily be match the threat that's coming at you. I mean, it is you having a reaction and a response to in self-defense, right? But this can also be, in terms of martial arts, Like, part of the clever thing about self-defense and martial arts is like it's teaching you to, like, if the other person's coming at you with a lot of energy, there's also teaching you how to redirect and neutralize what's coming at you by using their own momentum to help create that. But also, in respect of a lot of the things that I've done in life with community services, for example, and I've seen my female mentors just as much do this. I've seen them do this with women when they've been dropping into their wounded child wounds, as much as I've actually done this with men in community service environments when I was working in case management, and I was occasionally working with people in quite challenging environments. Like, I had to go see people at DHS, or I had to see people who had to take kids to prisons to visit their parents. There were times at which I had to be confident in dealing with people's shit and people's aggression and, them doing this at you, even though you're trying to do the right thing and you're trying to be the good guy and, help people sometimes. Sometimes people get in their stuff and when they're reactive. Another example, for example, one time I was working at a hospital and there was this lovely gentleman who, we had this thing about the lunchroom because I'd cooked falafels in the lunchroom a couple of days in a row. And there was one particular day where we were all in the lunchroom and in front of everyone, he kind of just went off around, oh, these freaking falafels, they freaking stink. I'm so sick of you doing this. And he started it was very aggressive and bullying, like in the way that he was around it in front of everyone. So I kind of did what they teach us to do in community services when the ultimate challenge of that situation was for us to have a conversation about what he needed and how we could share space lovingly, right? That's what was ultimately needed. But what he was doing was like doing it in a way that was kind of aggressive, and the tone of it was abusive and it was kind of bullying, right? So what I did was went into my strong mama directive, kind of just strong feminine mama type voice, right? And I just said to him, hey, dude, would you mind having a chat with me in the corridor just now? And the whole room, you could just feel them immediately kind of go, uh-oh, right? But I walked out with him, and the first thing that happened was that he immediately, before he was even in front of me, he was backtracking, he was apologizing, he was like already like, oh, I'm so sorry, I was so out of line, I was like, that was not okay what I just did. And then I just had a conversation. I said, it's okay, but please know that I'm happy. We both have to share this space together, and I want you to. I realize that I've done this several days this week, and if that's a point of uncomfortability for you, like, I don't have to be doing this every day, but I need to know, like, if there's something that's up for you, just come and talk to me. You can talk to me. It's okay. But just, tell me what you need in that respect. And then we had this great chat and we never had an issue again after that, right? But it's just the way it came out initially was like he wasn't expecting me to meet him, and he obviously had this pre-existing way of dealing with things, and there was just, I needed to put on the table another way that he could do things, right? But for a start, I kind of had to match that energy with a bit of firmness in order for it to go where it went. So that's my point around the positive of that, of being able to match and kind of in situations where it might call for us to kind of be a bit of that strong presence. That's being able to find the positive side of that, yeah? And then, and by the way, the action for this is basically tone it. So it's being intentional around the tone of, in which direction we go in. And being, again, where the ultimate thing is for any given relationship, it's about finding the point where our needs match up and how we better love and respect each other, right? So it's about picking the tone that goes with that and trying to direct our communication towards that. But we can get stuck in trying to be overly impactful to to have our voice heard when we don't realize yet how powerful our voice is, when we're just standing in our truth, full body, just owning it, heart-centered and willing to communicate it, yeah? It's actually way more powerful than we think it is, in the way that, think of it like, when you stand on a beach and it's windy and you're standing in the water. I think of this like, standing on a beach in Mornington Peninsula when it's a bit breezy. And like, you're standing there and you have to resist against the wind a little bit to stay there when it's really breezy, right? Otherwise, it might push you backwards a little bit. But it's not like the wind's trying to push you over. It's not like it's trying to be powerful. It's just the laws of natural law and basic physics and arguably quantum mechanics and the mechanics of how natural law and how the environment works, that the wind is just powerful. Yeah, it's not trying to be powerful, it just is. So part of this phase is coming into the realization that just when we stand there fully embodied, owning our truth and coming from our hearts, coming from love, it is powerful. It's powerful all by itself. It's also coming from a place of trust, because we're trusting in this place that all the people that we interact with, it's having an innate expectation that we want the best for each other, right? And nobody is necessarily going through life going, ooh, what can I do today? I just want to hurt 50 people. Like, it's very rare in life that, when we accidentally say something or do something that upsets someone that, it was coming from this space of, I'm trying to retaliate, I'm trying to hurt. Most of the time, people are just trying to do the best they can, yeah? Under often stressful circumstances. So this is also coming from a place of trust in that we all want the best for each other and we're all doing our best at all times. And that helps bring about a completely different outcome. But part of this as well is around this kind of, and I don't necessarily say in the same way, it's a little bit different on this one. It's not like positive and negative in the same way. It's a little bit more like give and receive. It's a little bit more like it can be, this can move in either direction, right? Because in this respect, you can kind of have two purposes for why you're sharing your truth, right? It might be potentially that you need something. So it might be that you need to share that you've recently had an experience. Is it okay for me to tell you what I'm going through right now? It might be personal and a little bit cathartic and about needing acknowledgement and your needs, right? So in that respect, it's like you might be needing to receive an energy from the dynamic or the conversation. Or it might be coming back over here, coming from the service space of us wanting to give and love the other person and be of service as best we can. And it might be in that respect that, we're wanting to, from a professional perspective, it might be us wanting to share something that we have wisdom around and that we know, and we're kind of completed in the learning journey of it as best we can, that we're like, okay, so this was the journey, this is what I learned from it, and now this is what I would teach you if you wanted to navigate your way through a similar circumstance. Here's what I would have to tell you, right? As one example of us giving in service. Whereas if we're in a personal process that we're like, hey, I've got no idea what I'm going through right now, I need some people to listen so I can soundboard with, that's more like in a situation where we're needing to receive support, yeah? So that's what I sort of say around give and receive potentially. And neither of those, see, I'm reluctant to label either of these as negative or positive because they're not. This is the innate reality of life and relationship, that there's an infinite flow going on all the time of give and receive, potentially, when we get aligned and we get out of our own way. Yeah, there's the potential for the universe is conspiring at all times to help us all be met, and so there's an infinite flow within that. But also, life is life, and in reality, it's not like we're 100% equal all the time, is it? So it can be like sometimes that, one person's giving a little bit, and then they're giving, and then this person's receiving. Or it might be going the other way. if those were two people, right? It could be operating in all directions, but, this is the case at the same time, yeah? So the thing that really helps us navigate this phase as well, the action, is being connected to ourselves, being connected to our sensory intelligence, our somatic intelligence, our intuitive intelligence, being able to be self-aware of what's coming up and going on for us so as we can stay in touch with what our needs are and communicate that. At the same time as it's also about staying in touch with, when we're talking to someone else or we're talking to an audience, what's going on for them right now? What's their experience? How are they receiving what we're talking about right now? So that we know to ask questions or pace ourselves or slow down or whatever might be required. This is about staying connected to ourselves and in tune with the other person in the dynamic so that we can maintain a two-way dynamic and make sure that we're doing our best to identify where we're both at and communicate live in the moment from where we're at, right? There's a great deal of power comes when we practice and harness our ability to do that. And then we're communicating our truth live in the moment from a place of love when we're doing that. And that's a beautiful place to be. That's ultimately, that's been my aspirational for the last several years. We're all human. I certainly have my moments where I fuck it up. And this has been a big learning for me, for sure. This is why I know about some of this stuff. But yeah, I would love to hear. I think that's pretty much the bulk of what I wanted to explain about this in this kind of webinar style explanatory video. Love to hear from you. What's been your experience in talking through this? Has some light bulb gone off for you? Have you had a realization within this? Is there something you want to talk through more? Have you experienced this? Where are you at after listening to this? Love to hear. Please feel free to share. And if anything's come up for you that you want to talk through, do feel free to reach out as well. But yeah, that's pretty much the basic outline of where that model has evolved to so far. And yeah, that's what I wanted to share. So thank you so much for being here and watching. Really appreciate it. And yeah, reach out if you have any comments or would like to chat.